We are here to talk about a very interesting topic, but again, a very well-worn topic. Crisis. Crisis, external and internal in poetry. Was just before us here, the panel from U.Chicago. We're touching upon the word crisis from the perspective of higher education. Poets are crisis-ridden, crisis-driven creatures, I think. Ever since the death of the first poet in the Western tradition, Orpheus, and the way in which he met his death, ever since Plato took up his cudgels against us and threw us out of his republic, we are both subjects of crisis, we are both purveyors of crisis, and we reflect in so many words. And I think our session will be quite able to uncover at least some. Time is of the essence, we know that, but some of the different ways in which the so-called external and the internal, they meld. The barriers between the two are very often breached. So what is internal crisis can become an external crisis and vice versa. And as we read our individual poems and as we talk around them, I think it will become absolutely clear. I'm joined in this session this evening here in Kolkata at the Bengal Club by two distinguished voices, poetic voices. Rosanna Warren, who joins us from faraway New York. Welcome, Rosanna, to the CANTO Poetry Festival, and to Kolkata, of course, although virtually. We hope that you will be able to visit this wonderful city someday in person. I'm also joined by Professor Aveek Majumdar, a very well-known face to the Illuminati of our city, to the intellectually minded, to the poetry lovers and literature lovers of this city. So we will go in that order. I will first invite Rosanna to talk to us and then read her poems to us, followed by Aveek, and I will come up third, and then we'll kind of have a little tete-a-tete amongst ourselves. And if there are any questions from the audience, we'll try and field them to the best of our abilities. So Rosanna, you're on.
Thank you so much, Debasish, and thank you to Aveek Majumdar and Lena and everybody else who put together this spectacular conference. When I hear the word crisis in relation to poetry, I immediately think of Stéphane Mallarmé and his 1897 essay Crises de vers, Crisis in Verse, so that where this high priest of French symbolism interpreted his crisis was entirely formal. He was writing about the emergence in France in the 19th century of the modern prose poem and of free verse. But the crises we're considering today under the title of external and internal seem to be more far-reaching in their consequence and in their description. They seem more to refer to the conditions under which poetry is composed, either external, political, economic, recently medical, epidemiological, and the internal states of the poet or the poetry reader, let's say moral, psychological, emotional. For my own poems, I don't think of myself so much as writing in or for crisis, though sometimes it looks like that, but more of intensities as Debasish said, which flow back and forth from the external to the internal to the external, because how could consciousness ever be located only in some kind of cell wall protected internality? I will read three poems which reflect different formal adjustments to this sense of crisis intensity, where I hope that the intensity of situations gets translated into intensity of language. The first poem I read is called The Crux. It's from my recent book of poems, So Forth. And crux is, of course, a pun. It means a cross. It could refer to, let us say, a Christian cross, a crucifixion. Also, it's a problem in interpretation where meanings cross. And this poem is full of puns. It's a sonnet. I I tried to write this poem for months, and it was originally 80 lines long and in free verse, and it eventually whittled itself down to a sonnet. It's about two prisoners on death row, and their cells are, you might say, almost sonnet shaped, very small uh, quadrangles of containment. And the poem comes from a photograph I saw of two men playing dominoes from their cells on death row, but they can't see each other. The domino board is laid out on the corridor, and you just see two black hands emerging through the bars to play the black and white domino pieces. So here's the sonnet in its strict containment for these men in their strict containment. The crux. Like playing dominoes on death row through the bars, so the little black rectangles form a cross on the prison hallway floor, and the dots wink like stars, while the corridor drives in merciless fluorescence to a vanishing point the camera captures as a chunk of dark. Is this what it's like to finger the end of a sentence that doesn't conclude? Let the dots hook up, hold off. We are convicted, if not convinced. Keep the game going. The pattern may hide a proof the crime wasn't what we thought. An end will come, but in a different plot. Now, a very different kind of poem, responding to what we might call a very different, well, it is a crisis. Schizophrenia is a terrible disease. Which destroys a person, well, not entirely destroys, but carves out a personality. And this is a poem in free verse. It's from my earlier book, Ghost in a Red Hat. It's called Fear. It's in free verse, but organized in couplets. There's no punctuation, and you will see there's considerable shattering of syntax. Fear. I follow, trying to pick up scraps of the poem as you drop them, you hide them, but they rustle. I pry them out from under cushions, under the bed. I pluck them like beaded curtain strings from the whoosh of water in the shower where you pretend to bathe when you are no one. No one is afraid of water. No one carves the soap so it won't touch his skin. It's the throb and splatter of water that drums the color out of each day. Good day, hello, hollow, spider fingers, sunken eyes, anti-soap for antimatter. You look out from a burned out star, light years away, still emitting photons with that appealing, deep, affectionate dog's look of frightful understanding, a magic cloak of smell. No one will touch. No one is safe. No one plays golf with interstellar swings so the ball never lands. TV keeps reciting the right spell day and night. The door is sealed shut with masking tape. Daylight strips human skin like acid. As long as the danger lived outside me, I couldn't write. It wants to crawl through the keyhole, slide over the windowsill. It breathes in the shirts hanging in the closet. It rots the cheese. It lives in my breath. It hides in the pages of the poems of Paul Verlaine like a smear of shit. It has signed a contract in ink squeezed from stars. You are the gentlest prayer. You see where the shadow falls across each eye. Of course, of curse, song of all our days. You were empty, so I drew a shrine, and it stayed empty. And I'll conclude with a short poem which emerged from what genuinely felt like a crisis in 2020, the emergence of COVID-19 and the near breakdown of our system of government in the United States. Before the vaccines were developed and we were living in various terrors, I was living in a cabin a very rough cabin in the mountains, and reading Thucydides to try to get some perspective on what was happening. So these are some phrases taken out of Thucydides, the Peloponnesian Wars, the plague in Athens, and the breakdown of political society in Athens. This poem also has no punctuation, and it is even more, the syntax is even more shattered than in Fear. They set about wasting the land. When the plague first broke out among the Athenians, when the plague out of Ethiopia spread into Egypt and Libya, and among the Persians, violent fever, bloody throats and tongues, vomit, blisters, foul breath, genitals, fingers, toes broke off. When the plague, we saw the moon rise. It floated over heaped, unburied corpses. Birds and dogs that ate them died. The moon rose over broken laws of God and man, smashed oracles, frantic mortal orgies. We saw, we heard words turned inside out, families broke, parties passionate for power crashed. No words were binding, no oaths reconciled. When the plague broke us, we broke each other. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rosanna. I'll reserve the questions for once we've finished our readings. A lot of questions, some beautiful poetry that you read and shared with us this evening. I would like to now invite Aveek to please, yes, go up to the podium and read his poems and talk to us about crisis.
Thank you, Debasish. I'll read out 5 poems from my recently published book, Agune Roab, The Rage of Fire. This is a tiny collection containing only 18 short poems. I must proudly mention that this book is published by Joy Kaveri Publication, the leading name of the duo being the towering poet of our time, Sri Joy Goswami. Before I begin, I would like to add a note. These poems are basically monologues written in simple verse, prose form. I admit that I have an inherent affinity towards writing in regular meter and using strict rhyming schemes. But these poems, with no separate name, only marked by number, surprisingly arrived in this format. I just accepted them. All my 5 poems are translated into English by Professor Ria Banerjee. You can see them on the monitor. Agune Roab 2। এটাকে ভূতের গল্প হিসেবেও পড়তে পারো। একটার পর একটা ন্যাংটো পাহাড় আকাশের দিকে তাকিয়ে সাধু সন্ন্যাসীর মতো বসে আছে, মাথায় শুভ্র কেশ। এই শৈল শহর কুয়াশায় রহস্যময়ী, যেন অবচেতনের উঁকিঝুঁকি। ঘোড়ার পর ঘোড়া উড়ে যাচ্ছে রাস্তা থেকে বিকেলের আকাশে। কেমন আছেন পশুপতিবাবু? কেমন আছেন জয়া দে সরকার, বিশাল ছেত্রী? ভূত মানে অতীত। 1984 সালে এক ধরনের ভূত। জলজ্যান্ত স্মৃতিকে কি ভূত বলা যাবে? সাহেবী পোশাকে মোহনরাজ সুব্বা আর তাঁর অ্যালসেশিয়ান ডিউক ওই হেঁটে যায়। দুজনেই মৃত, ও হলো ছায়া মাত্র। হে পর্বত দেবতা, আমি জানতে চাই কতটা বিভ্রম এই কুয়াশা মণ্ডিত পথে, দৃশ্য গুম্ফা বুনো গাছে, কতটা বিভ্রম ছায়া, কতটা বাস্তব। এগারো, কি যে বলো পথিকদা, শ্মশান মোটেই কোনো একমাত্রিক স্পেস নয়। আমি গত পরশু রাত 2টো নাগাদ 1857 সালের ফৈয়াজ আর মুনাব্বার শেখকে দেখেছি বুকে গুলির ছেঁদা নিয়ে পরদেশির দোকানে চা খাচ্ছে, কথা বলছে নকশাল শহীদ শান্তনু দস্তিদারের সঙ্গে। পরদেশির দোকানটাই তো 1989 সালে উঠে গেল ওর আত্মহত্যার পর। সময় জিনিসটাকেই বা যুক্তি দিয়ে বানাচ্ছ কেন? দিনকাল ভালো নয়। গাজনপুরের মাঠে এত রাতে আগুন জ্বালাচ্ছে কারা? ময়না নদীতে নৌকোয় হট্টগোল শোনা যাচ্ছে। এবছর ধানের বদলে নাকি মৃতদেহ পাওয়া যাবে মাঠে। অন্ধ সেই গণৎকার গিরিশ একথা বলেছিল। আমাদের উপর নজর রাখছে পাগড়ি পরা কয়েকটা মুখ, তারও উপরের ডালে বসে আছেন মহামায়া নন্দী, তীব্রভাবে তাকাচ্ছেন ইলেকট্রিক চুল্লির দিকে। বলেছিলাম না, সবসময় পৌরসভার কাছেও খোঁজ খবর থাকে না। বরং তুমি বলো, যারা পুড়ছে তারা অতীত না ভবিষ্যৎ থেকে এসেছে? 14, নিজেকে পরচুলার মুখোশ পরিয়ে লেখার মধ্যে ঢুকিয়ে দিই, কেউ চিনতেই পারে না। কখনো লিঙ্গ পাল্টে দিই, কখনো পুরুষ আর বচন। একটু পরেই আসবেন পণ্ডিত অপূর্ব সেন শাস্ত্রী। সেতার, মন্দিরার, হারমোনিয়াম গুলো সেজন্য জেগে উঠছে, হাত পা ছুটছে। ওই ঘন্টা পড়লো নিহারিকা মণ্ডলীতে, আর শোভারানী মুর্মুর সাইকেল চালকলের দিকে ঘুরে গেল। অপূর্ববাবু আলোর গায়ে হাত বুলোচ্ছেন যেন পোষা বেড়াল। কোন রাগ বলো তো প্রবীর? আমার কিন্তু রাতে খাওয়া হয়নি। ঘুমের মধ্যে সমানে ভারতবর্ষের পতাকা উড়েছে। মাটির ভেতর হাত পুরে আমি ঠাকুরদা ঠাকুমাকে ছুঁতে পারছি। ওই যে দেখতে পাচ্ছেন কয়েকটা পাখি উড়ে যাচ্ছে গঙ্গার ওপর দিয়ে, ওরা সবাই আমার মৃত বন্ধু বান্ধব, জন্ম নিয়েছে ফের। কিরে অমিতাভ, তুই কি এখন ময়দানের গাছে থাকিস? নমিতা, চন্দন, শুভ, দেখেছিস আমাদের পুরনো ছবিগুলো হাজারদুয়ারির সামনে বেঞ্চিতে পড়ে আছে, নাকি মাইথনে? 15, 7 দিন হলো আমার প্রেসক্রিপশন খুঁজে পাচ্ছি না। এরও আগে যখন শহরে প্রথম এসেছি, ওষুধ হাতে নিয়ে নিউ টাউনের দিকে ঘুরতাম, শরীরটাকেই খুঁজে পেতাম না। সত্যেনদা এত ঘন ঘন বিড়ি খাবেন না। মনে আছে আপনার সঙ্গে সন্তোষপুরের গলিঘুঁজিতে রোদ্দুর নিয়ে বাড়ি বাড়ি পৌঁছে দিতাম? সেই ঠিকানাগুলো ভুলে গেছি। এখন সন্ধ্যের দিকে তুফানের সতর্কতা। এখন খোলা জানলার সামনে বসে শ্রীমতী চন্দ্রানী চিঠি লিখছে সমুদ্রকে। স্বয়ং বঙ্গোপসাগর আজ বালিতে আছড়াচ্ছেন তার লেজ, একটু পরেই গিলে নেবেন সূর্য। চিঠি যেন তার আগে পৌঁছে যায়। ঈশ্বর, গাঁগঞ্জ থেকে শহরে এলেই বোঝা যায় কাকে বলে বাবু তামাশা, কেমন দেখতে শিল্পকলা। এখানে গঙ্গার বাতাস অন্ধ গলিতে ঢুকে খেপে গিয়ে বুকের ভেতর ভাঙচুর চালায়। আমি কয়েকবার রাস্তা হয়ে শুয়েছিলাম আর গা বেয়ে গড়িয়ে যাচ্ছিল পূর্ণিমার আলো। সেটা বড় কথা নয়। আমাদের অজান্তে যে মৃত্যু শাল ঝোলানো আছে কপালে, তার দিকে টর্চ জেলে বসে থাকতে পারেন সত্যেনদা? And the last one, 17, ক্রিকেট মাঠে বুঝলি অনিরুদ্ধ, রাত্রিরে একটা নক্ষত্র কণা পড়েছিল। কোন মাঠটায় বলতো? সমীর ডাক্তারের বাড়ির পাশে, কাঠগুদমের উল্টো দিকে। এখন প্রশ্ন হলো, ওটা কি মহাকাশ থেকে আসা কোনো অক্ষর? উজ্জয়িনী, তুমি কি আজ অফিস যাবে না? সহদেব কাকার ছেলেটাকে দেখতে হাসপাতালে যাচ্ছ তো? কি বললে? ওর পাঁজরের তলায় একটা রক্তপিণ্ড জমাট বেঁধে আছে। নদীর পাশে সুঁড়িখানা, উত্তর দিকে ভাঙা স্কুল বাড়ি, তার পাশে পুকুর। পুকুরের জলে সাঁতার কাটছে ছোট্ট একফালি আকাশ। যা বলছিলাম অনিরুদ্ধ, সৌরজগতের চেহারা আর পরমাণুর ভেতরের চেহারাটা একই রকম। ওই মহাকাশ লোকের দিকে তাকিয়ে এসব কথা ভাবি। অন্ধ বা বধির হয়েও তো জন্মাতে পারতাম, পিঁপড়ে অথবা মাকড়সা হয়ে। রাজু, তুই কি ক্রিকেট মাঠের দিকে যাচ্ছিস? পারলে একটা আয়না নিয়ে যাস। আরশির কাঁচ ফেটে গেলে বুঝবি গ্রহান্তরের মহাজাগতিক কোনো তরঙ্গ ওখানে ক্রিয়াশীল আছে। নমস্কার। থ্যাংক ইউ।
Thank you so much, Obigda. Again, a whole gamut of interesting ideas, as Obigda's poetry has taken us on a journey of spectrality, questioning time, questioning the poet's individual consciousness. And we will come back to all this after we finish our individual readings. Thank you again so much, Obigda. It falls upon me to read some of my poems. The first poem that I want to read is actually 3 rapid fire poems. It's called Monsoon Easels. This is from my book, Poppies in the Post. Monsoon Easels 1. I take the cue from the raindrops today. So it's a little bit of a rainy day, maybe a bit of thunder and lightning in the air. So I begin with this poem. Monsoon Easels 1. Thunder can be an unreliable guide. It often points everywhere. The path of thunder is not a way. It is a desire not to find one. Escape from the maze of the straight road. Monsoon Easels 2. Every house on this street is on fire in this rain. No one braves the rain, and there is no escape from the fire. Everyone is burnt wet. No wonder there is no smoke. Thank you. And I'll read this third one as well from this little section. Monsoon Easels 3. Which silence will I choose? Rain and wind tiptoe cautiously across night's chessboard. Moonfolk are getting heavy-winged. Soon it will rain bats and moths. Late coffee makes empty sounds in the cup, round and round like a circus by night. The sleeping cup their hands round the conch shell of their ears and hear the rain like the surge of an ocean in their dreams. Do they have a choice of silence too? Every sound is a memory. Every deaf raindrop remembers. So which silence will I choose tonight? Thank you. The next poem, Onitesh, could we have that first image up here? It's a poem about the last day of the painter Vincent van Gogh's life. It's called A Death in July, Morning Promissory. And of course, it particularly relates to a painting, a very, very famous painting, of course. It's called Wheatfield with Crows. So this is kind of a first-person account of the painter, apparently, on that last day. Not until told to sleep by the stern of watching did dawn appear at the beachhead of the window. The stars still at pasture had not heard the horn of light calling them to the pens of day. The ruttish road to the wheat ponders the rind and mire of my footfall. In this half-awake quiet, the only outcry is time roaring at the latch, howling through the keyhole, but only adding to the quiet in this room. My veins were loud as a bird last night that had found the dream of wheat in the rain on my hay-gold canvas too much light to sleep in. The hour hoists light outside, and I have to leave with this cureless, counted body for the shouting shadows on the sun's meadow. I am still asleep. And when I rise, no colors shall sun themselves, nor any sultry tear seek the shade denied by the windless cobalt that breathes as it dries above the church. The fields have assumed an army, sweeping into our wounds, and our houses lie startled rooks. I have to go stop them. And the last poem I'll be reading, of course, is from my latest collection, which is called Death of That Light. It's the very first poem in the book. It's about a very unusual Mughal painting of a man who has hanged himself in a courtyard. A very unusual subject dealt in Mughal painting, of course. So my idea was to write 3 poems, triptych around each one of these paintings. It's a very unusual painting, very colorful, but a very desolate scene, actually, and almost a taboo subject in Mughal painting. So that's why I chose it for the book. And I wrote 3 poems around it. One to deal with the actual event of the painting, perhaps the story of the painting, if I could put it that way. The second poem would talk about the perspective of the painter. And the third would be a very modern take on that painting. So I'm reading the first of the 3 poems from the section. It's called Not Yet Dawn. There is about this courtyard tonight a music that has burned my life. Silence. The ash that gathers beneath the heart of breath lamps is the glowworm's last sacrifice of its wings to keep the night from leaving. Dawn must be near. A star in the west melts in the dew like salt, and before my dry eyes, an early peacock that night could not put to bed or love melts in music that is still silence. Dawn would still come. Even the air mocks me as I stand in the middle of this courtyard, rope in hand, trying to string up a chandelier with no light, swinging in a faraway garden that I remember with the tall, dark firs in a fever of lilac. I want to get out of the air, but it is more difficult to get in. From a cold line of poetry I shall never write. My pain will drop like a ripe berry from the tree just yonder. The pitcher of wine that dyed the grains of snow in my heart's winter, but failed to portray morning, shall roll about in laughter on the stones of this courtyard. And it would still be silence. May dawn collect the tinted crystals of my dirty sweat, the pure essence of longing in a single tear of my pomegranate heart. Dear Jalaluddin, mighty emperor, in the din of your great day, a small ripple of news that some Tanha has hanged himself shall stir the petals in a marble urn by your afternoon rest. It shall stir the chameli fallen on the little pond skin by which my beloved daydreams that she is alone. There is still silence in this courtyard, and all this is not written. I go, the dried stalk of a rose that scratched the gap between 2 words on a page in the Quran. It is still not dawn. Thank you. Several, obviously, interesting points came up as we read our poems. And I would want to kind of get back to Rosanna, because Rosanna looked at crisis from a very different perspective. Of course, the internal crisis in the sense of actually some kind of a meta-poetic engagement, the decisions that us poets have to make as to form, as to content, and sometimes these decisions are colored or affected by other realities, personal and maybe more of the world. I mean, you read the COVID poem, of course, the syntax, the gradual disintegration of syntax as you went from poem 1 to poem 3, from the first to the third poem, is itself a kind of a statement about the disintegration of the world around us, our belief systems, because poetry, like everything else, has to stand on something, the terra firma. So when that goes, and a wonderful kind of an epigram that you came to at the end of the COVID poem, that it is not COVID that is actually killing us. It is the sudden realization that we are perhaps most fatal to each other, to ourselves. And it's, you know, it's just a ruse perhaps that it's the virus that is killing us. The greatest virus perhaps is the nadir to which human nature has fallen, where we have gone to. You know, of course, in the Renaissance, we knew about the humanitas, and then again, the divinatus and the feritas. Man can become a god, he can become an animal. You know, it's what he chose to be. What have we chosen to be? What have we come to? So I think, could you talk about the connection between preoccupations, decisions with syntax and poetic forms, and the reality beyond that?
Well, that's, of course, an enormous question. I'm interested in your word decision. I think, I suspect that each of you also have the feeling that sometimes you're not exactly writing your own poem, that the poem is writing you in some sense, that there's an interaction. You're ready, you've been prompted by many years. But for instance, Aveek described the poems arriving for him as in the form of prose poems, and he said, I just accepted them. But setting aside the question of decision, it also seems to me a question of translation. And I translate from several languages when I'm doing technical literary translation from ancient Greek or Latin or French or Italian. But I'm talking about translation now in a more metaphysical sense of translating a state of mind or soul in which is pre-linguistic into language. And so what you were noticing, Debashish, about the breakdown of syntax in these three poems I read is, yes, very much a product of trying to translate some form of experience of disintegration, whether it's political or psychic, into language, but not into chaos. The language has to find a form that accommodates the pressure of whatever realities are proposing themselves. And so that, to me, is the passion of poetry, is finding a form or letting the form find you. Well, I don't know if that makes sense, but that's how I experience it.
That's a wonderfully made point, Rosanna. I would next come to this interesting, and Rosanna, you must have been reading the translations of Aveek's poems. This negotiation of spectrality, time past, the possibilities, the fact that something might escape that closet of the past and actually fly out and be a part of our present. I think that's the uncanny, that's the ghost that Aveek was so powerfully invoking in each one of his different poems, the prose poems that he was reading out to us. So I think I would want Aveek to talk a little bit more about that and the ways in which he sees the persona of the poet engaging with that kind of a presence of the uncanny in poetry.
Thank you, Debashish. I'd rather add to Rosanna some new points. These are no theoretic musings as such, but sort of a confession of a poet, I should say. See, most of the times when I write poetry, the state of mind cease to be something which we call fully conscious. At that particular moment or time, I don't know whether the poem will continue for 4 lines, for 10 lines, will it be 20 lines? So you practically, you don't know whether voluntarily or involuntarily you are taking a decision. So I practically, I would say that I love to enter this space of magic and enchantment. But the problem is that space is pretty uncertain. Because if you may also find that whatever you are writing is incomplete one. You may have to throw it away. But your experience part is very interesting. And I would also say that what will be the metrical structure? Will there be any metrical structure? With or without rhyming scheme? If the rhyming scheme is there, which pattern it will come out? We don't know practically when we start writing. Once Valery said that the first line you get from heaven and the rest you create or you develop. Now my point is, my crisis is again the second line, the third line. Whether it will continue till 4th line. And of course, the shape in which it will come. If you look at those poems by Rosanna, I have seen them. Those structures are also linked to it, the crisis of the poem. You see, I would rather add another thing, that I presume that every poem has a mind and a body. The mind being the content, and body epitomizing the structure. Now, one very interesting point, Debasish, that Kuntaka, the great Indian aesthetician, he said in his book, Bhakrakti Jivita, he said, he defined poetry as the togetherness of mutually challenging excellences of word and meaning. Parashpara spardhita. Togetherness of mutually challenging excellences of word and meaning. On the other hand, in 1927 lecture, Valery, he confirms that fine poetry is a happy combination of sound and sense. He metaphorically imagined a pendulum which oscillates between the form and the content, between the sound and the sense, to strike a symmetry between value and power. Translated version uses that word, between value and power. A fantastic concept. But as a poet, I don't know how to master that skill. And every poem, when I finish it, obviously, I doubt whether the mind of the poem has been able to get or capture the most competent body or not. Now, whether it is the mind which is acting, but not a competent body, this is also very important decision. And thirdly, I should also look at that, what she said, Rosanna, thank you. When you are coming from form to content, say you are writing a villanelle or a sonnet, your stanzas are fixed, your rhyming pattern is more or less fixed, then my point is, my crisis, it is a bit external crisis. My crisis will be, will my flight of imagination occur in this structured form? How to control the structure, this strict structure, with the flight of imagination. And lastly, this is another crisis for me at least. Should we go for a meticulous editing of each and every poem? Editing, this word is interesting for poetry, because when you are editing, you are conscious. But at the time of writing, you are not fully conscious about what is happening. So when you are touching a poetry in a conscious mind, in the name of revision, correcting them, is it possible to correct? And also, other question is also valid, that without editing, will you go for printing? Now, what will be, my point is, what will a poet do? Also, we hear from critics that this poet has failed in this book. What is the meaning of failure? Nobody knows what is the failure of a poet. See, what is the difference between a serious poet and a popular poet? Can there be a mutual area? I don't know. When you were,
what is the difference between a good poetry and a bad poetry or worse poetry?
I don't know. Practically, it is very difficult for the poet to judge, because neutrally, can you neutrally judge your poem, your own poem? What is your goal of editing? I don't know whether I can make me understand. My crisis is this. So many crises around. And this crisis practically is the essence of writing poetry, the experience itself, the magical experience. I love, I don't know whether the poem is good or bad. I love to enter that area, because I don't know whether I enjoy. No, I don't enjoy. Practically, it is a fantastic experience. Thank you.
Thank you, Aveek. Thank you so much. The bringing together of opposites. I'm just reminded of a line that I keep teaching students in class ad nauseum sometimes. Of course, comes from a very famous poem by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Kubla Khan. You know, sunny pleasure dome with caves of ice. Exactly what he was talking about, bringing the opposites together.
Someone knocked the door and the poem gone.
Yeah, well, the other half,
Yes, the other half.
as Coleridge promised, the better half.
The better half.
So we make do with the worse.
Yes.
In our classrooms. The other interesting thing about is this idea I thinking off the top of my head from another very famous poem by Charles Baudelaire about the albatross. You know, the albatross, the bird that wings the seas, the majestic bird. And then again, it is also the bird that is mocked by the mariners because it cannot walk straight on the deck. So it's
It's the poet. It's the poet,
the
practically.
worst. So, he flies in those high skies, but he's also someone who can't walk properly on terra firma. So that's the dilemma of the poet. I would like to add another extra round of crisis, which I feel constantly, sometimes as a poet, from my audience, from my readership sometimes, is this idea that the poet and him being someone who births beauty. Now, beauty, the very definition of the word beauty can be a very difficult one for the poet to live with sometimes, because he is in a world that is full of sordidness, full of every kind of squalor and dirt and dearth and whatever. He is supposed to be on this quest for beauty. Now, the problem is, if he doesn't find beauty, quote unquote, as we see it, I mean, meaning harmony, meaning something that is picturesque, perhaps, something that is pleasant, not complicating anything, not very difficult, then I am afraid poetry loses so much of its force, of its power, its punch, because that definition of beauty, I think, is a huge deterrent to the poet, or it's a kind of shackle you put on the poet, that you are supposed to only show beautiful things. It's like the watch or the clock in several of these European cities where you have the Latin motto, Horus non optimi nisi serenus. I only count the hours that are sublime. What about the other hours? Because most of the hours are not sublime. What about the other hours? So does poetry completely let go of those hours? Does the poet not have to look at those hours or those events or those occurrences, those realities around us? So again, that is, I think, a real crisis sometimes. Because if you write a certain kind of poem, you get people coming back to you and saying that, isn't it your job, is it almost your task, holy task, to depict beauty? Where is the beauty in your poem?
And also, I'd also add that beauty, the concept of beauty is also very subjective. The beauty of, say, Sappho, the beauty as we find in Wordsworth, and beauty in Neruda, and in, say, Rabindranath, and in Jivanananda, and also Wallace Stevens. The concept of beauty itself changes with time. Practically, not only time, I would also say according to the positions, maybe. Beauty is a loaded term, and that can differ from one to another. My another point is, look at the reader. Say, we all know, if the readers reject a book of poems, if a critic harshly criticizes that this book is good for nothing, he has written some garbages, say, will the poet change his style accordingly? Is it possible? If they say that his version or perspective about beauty is not acceptable, will he change? Is it possible? Complex questions, Debasish. I don't know how Rosanna will like to react.
Well, I think the question of beauty is essential, and also your point, Aveek, about change, because there's no culture that's completely static. A poet, any artist, is constantly reinventing the idea and the form and conventions of what is beauty in that culture. It's interesting to me that you have both been mentioning a lot of French poets. You've mentioned Baudelaire, you've mentioned Valéry. I started with Mallarmé, but I'll come now to Rimbaud, who was certainly a poet who created crises of all sorts in the 19th century. And I don't think it's an accident we're talking a good deal about French poetry, of course, also a lot of Indian poetry of millennia and so forth. But France was in a way the petri dish for modernism that then forms of modernism that spread all over the globe. Anyway, Rimbaud starts A Season in Hell, his prose book, with the scene of I put beauty on my lap and I insulted her. Je l'ai insultée. And through the whole nightmare visionary adventure of The Season in Hell, you conclude not with beauty, you conclude with truth. The word truth, la vérité, to find la vérité in a body and a soul. And it seems to me that the constant breaking of beauty, to put together two words we've been talking about, breakage and beauty, to put together breaking and beauty is to talk about the life of poetry, that we always have to break what was beautiful before to find a truth that gives us a new forms, plural, of beauty, and that it should never stop. It could never stop until there's no more human being on earth, I think. Anyway, that's my idea of it.
Thank you, Rosanna, again. We are actually very nicely dovetailing our conversations around the idea of crisis, and there are many shapes and forms, hydra-headed crisis, if I could put it that way. So,
Yes.
yeah. So the other kind of crisis which some of my poems tackle, I think, is what we started with, the porous nature of the walls that separate the so-called external and the internal world so easily. And I think one of the great challenges for poetry, for poets over the ages, has been to transmute personal emotions, loss, whatever, into one of the most public of forums, without anyone being any the wiser of the true origins of that wellspring or that particular drive in the poem. And the other way is that, of course, where the political, I think, comes in very importantly, when a poet looks at affairs and events all around us in the world, and he inserts himself sometimes into that story, into that social tragedy or the effect of that time, and gives you a very closed account. I mean, I think this is one of the ways in which the poem is different from the novel, and also one of the ways in which perhaps, unlike the novel, which can be politically controlled sometimes. By the word political, I'm not meaning just by regimes, but in general, publishing industry and all the other norms that go into it. It's a more controllable form. You can give it some kind of a spin or a shape. Whereas poetry is a rather more difficult thing to contain. And I think in every age, it's poetry that gives you, especially if you want political status quo, the greatest problems. It's always that, because fiction can be, in a sense, controlled by certain larger historical or you might even commercial forces at play in the world. Whereas poetry can bypass them, can dive under and then suddenly come out like that proverbial dolphin. It can do that. So the poet is obviously, I don't say it's crisis, because crisis also means opportunity for me. Crisis, of course, as I said, decision making, but also risk, definitely, but also opportunity. So the new ways on which we can surprise, in which we can shock, in which we can make people think again differently, and perhaps like once again start feeling, when sometimes feeling is something that you are missing, is, I think, important. I would want quick comments from Avika and Rosanna on those points, if possible.
A narrative writer has a plot, Narrative writer has his characters or her characters. But for a poet, we have no plot. We have nothing. And we are entering an empty space. Thank you. Rosanna.
Oh, empty space. Yes. Well, maybe the word freedom, and I'm not sure I would. I'm not sure fiction can be so controlled either. Poets and fiction writers get sent to the gulag or threatened with death. But the word freedom is, I think, defines the life of art, any art. It is that the artist is making forms, not simply conforming to what a dominant society has said must be the case. And in that, to take up your words there, Debashish, risk and opportunity. Yes, if we're really making art, I think we're taking risks and we're trying to define new forms of freedom. And of course, freedom means also responsibilities and finding shapes, finding new boundaries. Yes, you've talked about challenges and challenging between subject matter and language. Yes, that's where we live, in a state of peril, but glorious peril, fantastic peril.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rosanna.
Thank you,
And,
Rosanna. Thank you.
That's now we can have a couple of questions from the audience.
I mean, this is a general question as such, but when you're talking about crisis, I mean, over the past few decades, we've seen how the rise of globalization, the emergence of a kind of corporatocracy, and a specific kind of consumerism has emerged. And in that context, I mean, sorry, I have to finish this off. So even though, I mean, starting from, say, people like T.S. Eliot to a lot of modernist poets, we've heard of how the individual is becoming fragmented, the society is becoming alienated. We've heard of that. But over the last few decades, I mean, there's a different kind of fragmented individual we're coming across. An individual who is perhaps more and more of a consumer than an individual. Instead of cultivating our individuality, we are perhaps cultivating a more refined sense of a consumer. In this sense, how do you think this is being reflected in the emerging poetic practices? And if so, I mean, how do you think this is driving or informing our poetry? I don't know if perhaps a very generic question, but
You know, we need another 2 hours to answer. My point is, you see, you were referring to Eliot. So we'll be waiting for another Eliot to come. That is a smart answer, you know. But I should say that poets from different parts of West Bengal, in other states, and globally also, all poets are trying to confront with this situation and look at the shape and content of poetry, which is also changing and which is becoming a mirror of this reality. And in a way, they're protesting from inside. That is the main point. The poets are on. The poets are trying to confront with the reality. And they will, I believe, will continue to confront the reality. Thank you.
আমি একটা দুটো মানে অভিজ্ঞতা এবং দেবাশিসদার কথা, ইভেন রোজানার সঙ্গেও একটা কথা শেয়ার করার জন্য আমি 2-3টে কবিতার উল্লেখ করছি। আমার ধারণা এটা এই আলোচনাকে খানিকটা সিগনিফাই করছে। রণজিৎ গুহর একটা কবিতায়, রণজিৎ দাসের একটা কবিতায় রণজিৎ দাস এভাবে সম্ভবত শুরু করেছিলেন, আমি শ্রী থেকে বলছি, কবিতা পবিত্র লিপি, অপবিত্র হাতে থাকে, স্পর্শ করো না। এখানে কবিতার যে পবিত্রতার কথা রণজিৎ দাস বলছেন, তারপর পুরো কবিতাটা সেটা ব্যাখ্যা করতে করতে গেছে। ওটা আসলে আমার মনে হলো যে কথাটা অভিজ্ঞতা বলছিলেন, যে কবি কি লিখতে চাইছেন, কোথায় যেতে চাইছেন। এই যে পিউরিফিকেশনের কথাটা, মূর্তিমতি, সম্ভবত কবিতা মূর্তিমতি কবিতার নাম, সুনীল, কবিতা লেখার কথা আসছে এবং বারবার করে কবি ফিরিয়ে আনছেন একটা পংক্তি ধ্রুবপদের মতো, কি সে লেখে, কবিতা না কবিতা রচনা করে তাকে। মানে আমার ধারণা দুটো কবিতা দুজনকে কমপ্লিমেন্ট করছে। একজন বলছে যে অপবিত্র হাতে তাকে স্পর্শ করো না, আর একজন বলছে আমি তো লিখছি না, কবিতা আমাকে নির্মাণ করছে। আর একটা কবিতার থেকে আমি জাস্ট কয়েকটা লাইন পড়বো, যে কারণে আমি বাংলায় প্রশ্নটা করছি। না হওয়ার গল্প, বীরেন্দ্র চট্টোপাধ্যায়, যেখানে শুরুই হচ্ছে সে চেয়েছিল একটি সত্যিকারের প্রেমের কবিতা লিখতে, তার তো একটাই জীবন। আমি পুরো কবিতাটা পড়ছি না, বড় কবিতা, একদম শেষে কবিতাটা শেষ হচ্ছে এভাবে, এই কি মানুষের জীবন, তার একটি মাত্র প্রেমের কবিতা, কবিতা, তুমি এখন 3 ভুবনের কোন অতলান্ত অপ্রেমের মধ্যে ঘুমিয়ে আছো। ঘুমাও, তুমি ঘুমাও, আর আমি জেগে থাকি আর এক আরম্ভের জন্য। মৃত্যুর মুখোমুখি আমি জেগে থাকি। কবিতা, যে প্রেমের কবিতার জন্য একজন কবির জার্নি, সে প্রেম এলো কি এলো না, সেটা এখানে একটা ওপেন এন্ডেড ভাবে শেষ হয়। আমি ব্যাপারটাকে এভাবে শেষ করি, যেটা সৌনকের সঙ্গে মেলে না, খানিকটা হয়তো কোন একটা জায়গায় গিয়ে রেজনেট করে, যে অভিজ্ঞতার কবিতা তো আমি দেখছিলাম যে সময় তার নানাবিধ লেপটে জাপটে পাল্টে যাবা, অস্তিত্বহীনতার কথা আমার বারবার করে মনে হচ্ছিল। তার মধ্যে যে ডিস্টোপিয়াটা আছে, তা জন্ম দিচ্ছে যে সময়টা, তার মধ্যে একটা আইডিওলজির ভাঙন আছে, তার মধ্যে একটা রাজনৈতিক অবক্ষয়, বিশ্বাসভঙ্গ, স্বপ্নভঙ্গের কথা আছে, যেটা একজন কবি, তিনি তো প্রেমের কবিতা লিখতে চান, তা হয়ে ওঠে রাজনৈতিক কবিতা, তা হয়ে ওঠে মৃত্যুর কবিতা, তা আবার জীবনের কবিতা। বিশুদ্ধতার কবিতা কবি লিখতে চান, অথচ সে কবিতা লেখাই হয় না, কবি তাকে লেখেন। মানে আসলে কোন অবক্ষয় কবিকে দিয়ে কি লেখাচ্ছে, কোন অবক্ষয় তার প্রেমের যন্ত্রণার কবিতা লেখাচ্ছে, তা কোনো গণহত্যার সঙ্গে রিলেটেড কিনা, এই জায়গাটা আমার মনে হয় একটা বৃহত্তর সংকটকে এক জায়গায় একটা উপত্যকা এনে ফেলে। এইটুকুই আমার বলা।
জীবনানন্দের একটা লাইন আছে না, যে এত নিশ্চয়তা কে জানিতে পারে, আর নিশ্চয়তা নেই তো কবির সামনে।
Thank you, Anitesh. Thank you, Aveekda. Thank you, Rosanna. So we can only promise on behalf of all poets of the world that we shall not go quietly into the night, and that we are at the hot gates every day of the year. Thank you so much. Thank you, Aveek Majumdar, for inviting all of us and making this CANTO Poetry Festival possible. Thank you so much.